Boethius is one of the most influential figures in Western history, whether or not most people actually know of him. Considered the last great Roman philosopher, he powerfully synthesized the classical teachings of thinkers such as Plato and Seneca with the developing Catholic worldview of 6th century Europe, leading some to name him the Christian Stoic. I've mentioned Boethius before on this channel, and his didactic works feature prominently in early medieval monastic education, but what he's really known for, what really sets him apart, is his magnum opus, titled De Consolatione Philosophiae, or The Consolation of Philosophy. The importance of this work cannot be understated, and even just in the realm of English literature, it's been hugely influential on King Alfred the Great, Geoffrey Chaucer, Queen Elizabeth I, C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and others. But why? What is it? What makes it so great, so influential, so appealing? That's the question that I hope to answer today. Stay tuned. So much of philosophy is about death. What is death like? Why do we die? What happens after we die? How should we think about dying? In his Phaedo, Plato quotes Socrates as saying, "Hoi orthos philosopuntes apotneskein melatosi." That is, those who are practicing philosophy correctly are really practicing to die. Cicero glosses this in his Tusculan Disputations, saying, "Tota enim philosophorum vita ut aetidem commentatio mortis est." That is, the whole life of the philosopher, as Socrates says, is a meditation on death. Young Boethius, a wealthy and well-educated Roman boy, was definitely brought up reading Plato and Cicero and thinking about these sententiae, these teachings. He probably spent a lot of time thinking about what his own death would be like. I'm sure that you have thought about your own death when reading stuff like this, as have I, as has anyone who has really read good philosophy, or anyone who has really just sat and thought with themselves in a meaningful way. But very few of us in today's day and age will be given a chance to test how well we've prepared for our own death the way that Boethius was. In 523 AD, at 43 years old, Boethius found himself on the wrong side of political tensions in the Ostrogothic court. He was arrested, unfairly sentenced to death by Theodoric the Great, and executed a year later. It is in this setting, on death row, that Boethius writes The Consolation of Philosophy, which is essentially him taking about 5 books to steel himself for his own death. If you're unfamiliar with the literary device of the dialogue, you might find the way that the Consolation is written a little odd, but it's in a long tradition and from an artistic perspective, nothing new. Just as Plato and Cicero will often attempt to demonstrate a philosophical point by writing a dialogue between 2 semi-fictional characters discussing that point, Boethius writes The Consolation of Philosophy as a dialogue between 2 characters, one being himself and the other being a woman he names Philosophia, that is a sort of personification of philosophy, his philosophical education, often referred to in English translations as Lady Philosophy. The effect is that Boethius, representing the sort of average person who might feel like they have room to complain about their life circumstances, presents a list of complaints and counter-arguments to philosophy. She in turn methodically debunks each point, bringing her wayward student back into the fold of impenetrable mental fortitude and bravery in the face of death that should be inherent to the life of the philosopher. The first book starts with Boethius in jail, in the depths of despair, surrounded by the muses no less, singing about his misfortune, how sorry he feels for himself, and how no one has ever had it as bad as he does in that moment. Lady Philosophy comes into the room, furious at the state of her former pupil, and throws the muses out, castigating them for making a miserable man more miserable. She then launches into her attempt to rescue Boethius from his state of depression, which means a good amount of argument, lecturing, and consolation, hence the name The Consolation of Philosophy. The first thing you might remark at, however, is the extreme circumstances that Boethius is actually in. If a mother found her child crying over a broken toy, and she was of a bit more of a stoic fiber, she might lecture that child on how it's improper to mourn something like a broken toy. This is exactly what's happening between Boethius and Lady Philosophy, but Boethius hasn't exactly lost a toy. He has lost all his fortune, all his land, all his assets, all his wealth, more than that, his wife, his 2 sons, his lord, and most of his friends have seemingly turned on him, and he's about to lose even his life. So, I think this is actually one of the only instances where you can use the turn of phrase, he has lost everything, and yet he's upbraided for mourning? This should be the first indicator that this is truly unique literature. A man, a real person on death row, who has suffered one of the worst turns in fortune imaginable, essentially telling the world through the mouth of his character Philosophia that even he has nothing to mourn and no reason to feel sorry for himself. If that doesn't pique your interest, I don't know what will. Boethius, right at the beginning, purporting that philosophy has the power to console someone even in those circumstances, and then using the rest of the work to explain exactly how, tackling 4 major questions, which I'll go over now. Number 1, the Rota Fortunae, the Wheel of Fortune. Boethius didn't come up with the idea of the Wheel of Fortune, but he is credited with popularizing it in Western thought. When you hear that phrase, you might think of the American game show, but have you ever wondered why it's called Wheel of Fortune? It's because, at least historically, that concept has evoked an image of people attached to some sort of giant wheel, which brings some of them up and pushes some of them down. Some are fortunate enough to be taken to the top, others are unfortunate enough to be thrust into the mud and crushed under the wheel's weight. For a game show, this is a fun and semi-learned way of advertising themselves as a chaotic and exciting factory of winners and losers. For Boethius, the wheel is society, and the tyrannical figure of Fortuna, or Lady Fortune, seems to have been given free rein by God to turn the wheel and randomly inflict good things and bad things alike to the people of the world. This addresses the first and foremost complaint of Boethius, that he has been treated unfairly by Lady Fortune. He laments what he describes as the fortunae saevientis asperitas, the sort of savage ferocity of fortune, who has taken everything from him and ruined his life for seemingly no reason. Have you ever had someone complain to you about bad luck, or seen someone struggling with something that didn't really seem to be their fault? Have you ever had a run of pure misfortune where, through no fault of your own, things just don't go your way? Well, I suspect none of us have had quite as bad luck as Boethius, but his character, Lady Philosophy, responds to his misery by saying, "Stop crying and be honest with yourself. Why are you surprised that this has happened? Who lied to you and told you that fortune is somehow permanently on your side? How could you frame this as a betrayal on her part, who never made any false pretenses of loyalty to you?" And that is essentially to say that all of the nice things that Boethius lost were only gained in the first place because he was placed in fortunate circumstances. If you are going to allow yourself to be raised by the Wheel of Fortune, you cannot complain when you are inevitably lowered by the Wheel of Fortune. Lady Philosophy actually pretends to argue against Boethius from the perspective of Lady Fortune, and her argument is pretty convincing. "Why are you angry with me?" she asks. "Which of your possessions have I taken? What thing did you own that I have stolen from you? I gave you wealth, I gave you honor, I gave you a nice position at the court, I gave you a wife and 2 sons. Am I the only being in the universe that isn't allowed to take back my possessions? What legal argument would you have against me?" Lady Philosophy answers these questions herself, telling Boethius that if Lady Fortune had really said this to you, quid profecto contra iceres non haberes, that is, I don't really know what you would have to say in response. None of these good things that you enjoyed were actually part of you or your own possessions. Nice clothes were just covers on your body. Nice jewels were just nice to look at, so how are they any different than like a mountain or a lake? You don't own those. How did they ever reflect anything good about your actual character? And if they didn't, how can you feel indignant over losing them? In pushing this line of thought, Boethius is representing a very classical Roman progression from Stoicism found most strongly in the writings of Cicero and Seneca. Seneca was a capital S Stoic, meaning that he believed in things like the cyclical reincarnation of the universe, but Cicero, who was more of a vibes-based philosopher, picked and chose what he liked from Stoicism, and really blended it into his more general virtue-based Roman philosophy. This is more of what Boethius seems to be doing, who doesn't believe in things like the reincarnation of the universe, but does echo ideas such as the disregard for material possession. Cicero and Seneca both praise this as a virtue, and they both give parallel accounts of a historical figure, Bias of Priene for Cicero and Stilpo of Megara for Seneca, who loses everything they own. Their whole city, their whole family, all of their friends, their possessions are destroyed, and in response, all they say is, "Omnia mea mecum porto," that is literally, I am still carrying all of my things with me. I still have everything I own. Seneca has his Stilpo go even further, saying, "Nihil perdidi, omnia mea mecum sunt." I have not lost anything. Everything that I own is still with me. This is the kind of cold water that Lady Philosophy dumps on Boethius. Stop complaining. You haven't lost anything. Your intellect, your capacity for thought, your good virtues, your history of good deeds, these are your real possessions, and no one has taken them from you, and no one can take them from you. In terms of immaterial losses, like fame, Lady Philosophy is even harsher, laughing at the foolishness of any mortal who would seek fame. Does the opinion of the masses actually mean anything about your true character? What's the point of desiring fame in such a small, vain world anyway? Let's say you were known throughout the entire Roman Empire. They still wouldn't know who you were past the Caucasus. And even if you were known by literally everyone in the whole world, would that save you from death? How many people were very famous and very well respected and well loved in their time, and now we have no idea they ever even existed? Even if your name lives for thousands of years, what is that against eternity? Fame is all vanity, she says, and means nothing to God nor to the angel of death. And anyone who desires to live on after their death through their fame, once that too has been wiped out by the inevitable press of time and decay, all they will have achieved is dying twice. To someone who doesn't care about any of this, the Wheel of Fortune can only be a good thing. When it treats you well, you are experiencing certain pleasures. When it treats you poorly, you're given the opportunity to test your virtues and learn more about yourself and the world. Lady Philosophy gives the example of friends. Boethius has lost some friends, but now he has learned which friends are true to him and which friends aren't. That is, the ones that stood by him and are trying to defend him are the ones that were his real loyal friends. The ones that vanished, well, they were never friends to begin with. Learning something like this is objectively a good thing, and if Boethius hasn't lost anything, then this whole ordeal is essentially a net positive. Number 2. True happiness. You might be thinking at this point, okay, sure, that's all well and good, but it's still good to have nice things. If that's where you're at, then Boethius is right there with you, and he raises some objections. These things still made him happy. They still had good benefits. For example, he protests that while they may not have been his own possessions, things like dignitates, that is, positions of power, displays of honor, did serve to confer honor and veneration onto their recipients. Lady Philosophy responds, but is it the case that these positions of power and honor actually improve their recipients, or do they more commonly corrupt them? Is there any real correlation in human history with positions of power and respect and actual quality of person? Think about someone like Nero, who was the most powerful person in the world while he lived, but even then, and certainly afterwards, was the object of mass derision and hatred. Is that what you want for yourself? Would you even be happy as a king or an emperor in a position that has been described as living your whole life with a sword hanging over your head? We can apply the same question to modern times. Think about how many rich and powerful people nowadays are just utterly detested by basically everyone in the world. Think about how many of them are regularly targeted, threatened, assaulted, or even assassinated. Is that enviable? Not only are these people in constant danger just by nature of their position, they also have more to lose, more to worry about, and in the constant pursuit of power, they are really no more comfortable than any random person who wants something that they don't have, and they're certainly not more virtuous. Now, this doesn't mean that they aren't enjoying better material pleasures, but someone who greedily hoards wealth might not be enviable simply because they're greedy. Why would anyone want to be given over to base desire? It should be much more desirable to be a virtuous person, and you don't need any wealth or power or respect for that. So power itself cannot be enough for happiness, nor can wealth, nor can fame, nor can any of these things. They are all just purported means to happiness, which can all be demonstrated as ineffective. Here's where Lady Philosophy would rather have us look. Let's accept that happiness is the highest good in life. There cannot be multiple highest goods in life. If one thing is the highest good, it must be synonymous with anything else described as the highest good. As a Catholic, Boethius defines the highest good as God. Therefore, for Boethius, happiness, the highest good, and God are all synonymous. Therefore, it follows that happiness is only to be sought with God. What it means to seek God, Boethius doesn't really say. He probably thought that that question had already been well enough answered by other philosophers. He also tends to avoid the details of religious life. He uses very broad, classical vocabulary, and his teachings are therefore very applicable to anyone of really any monotheistic religion, or really, in my opinion, a lot of atheists as well. His next question is much more critical of what Lady Philosophy is telling him, and probably shared by any atheists watching this video. Number 3. The problem of evil. If God is the highest good, and God is omnipotent, how can these horrible things have happened to Boethius? How is there evil in the world at all? He turns his complaints now to this question, saying that all of his miseries seem to stem from the fact that even though God rules the world, he still allows evil to exist, and not only exist, but thrive unpunished. Who can complain enough, he says, about all of these things happening with a supposedly all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving God? Lady Philosophy's response is initially head-scratching, at least to me, and definitely to Boethius. She says that if we really pay attention, we will notice potentes esse bonos, malos vero objectos. That is, the good are powerful, and the evil are weak. You might be thinking, what is a great philosopher like Boethius doing giving us vacuous, feel-good platitudes like this? But it's not that simple. This is her reasoning. Let's assume that all people, at their core, desire happiness. We have hopefully demonstrated now that even if you don't believe in God, this happiness is a high good that cannot be defined by wealth or power or fame. Now let's take the concept of power, which is really, truly the ability to do something you want. It follows that we can say someone who is capable of doing what they want is powerful, someone who is incapable of doing what they want is not powerful. The good and the wicked both desire happiness, but the wicked are unable to attain this highest good and pursue it in vain. Therefore, they are incapable of achieving what they really truly want and are therefore not powerful. Meanwhile, the good do attain what they truly desire and are therefore powerful. Boethius extends this reasoning to the capacity to do good and the tendency towards evil. That is, if someone is in a position of power and they only use that power to commit evil, evil is per se insubstantial, meaning it can't exist except in relation to the good. So if you only have the ability to do evil, you really have the ability to do nothing. To use power for good, however, is to be able to actually do something substantial, which is truly powerful. Again, if all people desire happiness, and some people only use their power to commit crimes and do things that are going to lead them away from goodness and happiness, can we really describe these people as powerful? In this line of reasoning, Boethius is drawing strongly from Plato's Gorgias, which he actually quotes. Plato writes Socrates as saying that it is essentially only the wise who are ever able to achieve what they actually want. The unwise, on the other hand, are doomed to always be struggling after things that they can never achieve. The Gorgias also informs the point that Boethius goes on further to make, which is that the wicked can benefit immensely from punishment, because it can take away corrupting factors, help them learn from their mistakes, and stop them from their evil ways. I think everyone can think of someone in our day-to-day lives, perhaps even ourselves, who received some sort of divine punishment. That is, they were caught cheating, caught stealing, and generally sent to rock bottom and forced to face justice in some way. These people can, not always, but sometimes recover in really healthy ways, and most of the examples that I can think of in my life, these people are much healthier now, much better people, and much happier for it. This serves to inform us of two truths. One is that heavy cathartic downfalls can actually be a saving grace for people stuck in evil behavior. The second is that people who do not experience these downfalls are often worse off for it. They might never learn, they might never improve as a person, they might never wake up to what they're doing, they might die having lived a terrible life, inflicting nothing but pain and suffering on themselves, the people around them, and if they're powerful, everyone in the world. Is that enviable? With all that in mind, maybe the world does start to look a bit more just. For Boethius, however, a more pressing question emerges. Number 4. Free will. Let's accept what Lady Philosophy has said up until this point, that the world is justly governed. If that is the case, how can there be nostri arbitrii libertas, that is, freedom in what we decide, free will? If God isn't actively moving every atom in the universe, he still sees everything. And if God sees everything, and he knows the future, and everything that he knows is true, then he can see all of our future actions, he knows that they're going to happen, and that means that they're bound to happen. So how can there be free will? Lady Philosophy insists that there is free will, but one can only see it if one acknowledges that the way we view the world and the way God views the world are different. That is, for Boethius, God's mind is not constricted to a linear temporal experience, allowing him to view all of time at once. We, on the other hand, seem to constantly move forward in time. For this reason, it might seem that God can see the future, but for him, it's actually more like flipping through pages of a book, in that every moment in time appears to him as the present. If you saw someone walking down the street, you could observe them, and you would know in that moment that they were walking. But that knowledge doesn't actually dictate the state that they're in, nor does that knowledge compel them to continue walking. In that sense, God's foreknowledge of your actions is really more like a continuous present observation. Assuming you have free will in the present moment, which Boethius does, taking God as more of an omniscient judge than a sort of ever-present mover, none of your actions would be predetermined. And that's all he has to say. It's unclear whether or not he intended to write more. Certainly, there are still unanswered questions, but shortly after finishing that last chapter, he was put to death by Theodoric the Great. His fears of death were therefore validated, but in meeting that death, he seems to have been truly at peace and fully consoled by his former tutor, Lady Philosophy. His legacy is an incredibly moving testament of the power of Stoic and Christian thought, and has consistently motivated people over the last 1500 years to cast aside their worries, stop feeling sorry for themselves, and really seek the highest good in life. How do you read it? Well, anyone who's followed this channel knows that I really like lobes, and this is no exception. I would definitely recommend the lobe, especially if you can get a used copy. I first read this book with the lobe before I knew Latin, and then when I was learning Latin, it was obviously a great learning resource to be able to read the Latin on one side and then reference the English on the other. I will warn you, if you are trying to read Latin, if you're learning Latin, Boethius is not easy. Probably one of the hardest Latin writers that I've ever really seriously engaged with. But it's beautiful Latin. I mean, it's beautiful literature. So I would definitely recommend that. At least keep the option open for yourself to one day learn the Latin and read it as Boethius really wrote it. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you like content like this, check out the rest of the channel. Kindly consider subscribing or becoming a supporter on Patreon. And until next time, farathie alle Yesunde.